He is risen indeed, friends. We welcome you at New Hope. We are now starting a new season, and we are thrilled that you can be with us wherever you're joining us from. We're looking forward to this season that here at New Hope we're going to call Thriving, Not Surviving. It was about a year ago as we were processing this season and looking ahead from 2019 to where we are today in 2020. And we are convinced that God was laying perspectives on us even then, preparing our hearts, getting our minds ready and situated so that we would be prepared for the Easter that is now upon us. I've been hearing a word more these days than I think I've ever heard it in my entire life, the word surreal. It's surreal out there today. It is surreal. Well, I can tell you that the most surreal thing that's ever happened, surreal, is when your reality is just so stunning and so overwhelming that you just can't really process it. It is just more than what your senses are capable of taking in. And I can tell you that if there's been one signature central event that has redefined history as a surreal event, then it was Easter. And if Easter, as surreal as it was, is capable of speaking in any situation at all times and all places, then we can be sure that Jesus will visit us even in our surreal situations here in 2020. We are not going to survive this situation. We are going to thrive in this situation. That's the mentality that we need to approach this with. And what better season to get our minds around it than at Easter? I have with me today one of the most remarkable objects in history. It doesn't look like much, does it? But this is a Hebrew shofar. And it was their version of a trumpet in their early history. If we rewind to the days of Moses and around the time when they were conquering their foes, Moses would tell them to sound the trumpet. And when the trumpet was sounded, they knew it was a signal to get mobilized. Get mobilized because God is moving ahead of you, and it is not your fight, but it's God's to win. And so when they heard this little object, they knew that it was a signal to get in place, to get mobilized, because something big and wonderful was getting ready to happen. Of course, there are many stories throughout the Old Testament where the trumpets were sounded and then things began to unfold and the earth trembled and the world shook and God's mighty presence was felt. But undoubtedly, I think without debate, the most prominent story where you find the trumpet sounding and wonderful things happening has to be that story in Joshua. You know the story. The story where God's people are gathering around a massive fortress known as the walls of Jericho. And they didn't really have any weapons, they didn't really have any chariots, they didn't really have any fierce stallions, they didn't have any sharp spears, they didn't have many swords to go around. These people had been slaves in Egypt, and they didn't have Green Beret training in their history, and they had spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. It wasn't like they were out there, training how to use spears and swords properly. What they did have was this little thing made out of a ram's horn, and when it sounded, God commanded them to get mobilized and told them that when the trumpet sounded, know this, the battle is the Lord's. And so when the trumpet sounded, the fortress collapsed. It was like the storming of the Bastille. And at that sound and at that signal, the people knew that they were moving from this place of wandering and this place of aimlessness into a land of promise. When the trumpet sounds, barriers come down, walls collapse into dust, and then we process into the land of promise that God has prepared for us. Well, this Easter season, as we go through this series over the next several weeks together, thriving, not surviving, What we're going to do is we're going to look at the forgotten miracles of Easter. It is undoubtedly the case that when we think of Easter, we think of the supreme miracle, the miracle of all miracles, the resurrection of Jesus. But notice how that supreme miracle set forth a ripple effect of other miracles. And over these next few weeks, we're going to give you 10 P words that show what these grand and extravagant miracles were that proceeded out of a ripple effect. Beginning with our first P word, proclamation. Proclamation. The proclamation of the Lord. What you find in the Old Testament is the trumpet sounding and walls coming down and people proceeding into the land of promise. But when you get to the New Testament, then you have the voice sounding like a trumpet. Our voice is to sound like a trumpet. Walls will come down and we will process into the land of promise. Paul is writing one of the last letters he will write in Timothy. And he's writing to young Timothy, and he's passing a mantle to him to carry it on after Paul is gone. Commentators are in agreement that Timothy and Titus are the last letters that Paul will write. And imagine that as he's sitting on death row and writing these letters to Timothy, Timothy hearing these letters might be thinking to himself, do I really want to do the things that a person on death row happens to be doing right now? Do I really want to follow in those footsteps? But Paul told Timothy, I'm in confinement. I am in shackles. I am bound in chains. I am in solitary confinement. But know this, I might be chained, but God's word is unchained. And so when the word sounds, when someone like Paul can't keep it inside, it is a signal that walls are going to come down, that God is on the move, that this battle is not our battle, and that God is mobilizing us into action. We can't keep it inside. It is an uncontainable voice like a trumpet. And it started just on that Easter morning, on a morning just like this one. We see Mary of Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, a person who had been known as having mental issues and had a past history of brokenness. Jesus didn't worry about her credibility. Jesus didn't worry about all her baggage from her past. Jesus didn't worry that the moment she went back and told those disciples, he is risen, that they might think, oh, she's sliding into her past again. The trauma has just made her woozy. It's made her dizzy. She's hallucinating again. Now she's rambling. Now she's incoherent. Jesus made Mary Magdalene the first voice like a trumpet. And she could hardly wait to get back to sound it. It was a signal. God was on the move. Get mobilized. Things are getting ready to happen. And remember, those depressed, sorrowful disciples on the road to Emmaus, they were headed away from the resurrection. They were convinced that maybe just evil had won out. The travesty of justice had dominated and there was nothing more that they could do. So they were on their way out. They were making a silent escape. And yet they would discover Jesus is risen. And wherever they were on that road to Emmaus, they could not wait to run back to their friends and tell them, he is risen. And I can guarantee you those disciples heard the sounds of trumpets when those disciples from Emmaus came around the bend, and they were signaling that strange and wonderful things were getting ready to happen. But maybe the best story about voices sounding like trumpets, that will be found in Acts chapter 5, verses 38 through 41. Do you remember the story? It is when Peter and John are arrested, and they're brought before a tribunal. They're brought before religious authorities, and they're told that you are doing the very same thing that we crucified Jesus for doing. Why are you doing this? We will torture you for this. We will flog you for this. We will make you feel pain for this. But Peter and John thought, we can't keep it inside. This is uncontainable. When the trumpet sounds, God is on the move. It's only our business to get mobilized. God has equipped us with a voice like a trumpet. And so one of those members of the tribunal, one of those members of the religious authorities, a man named Gamaliel, we don't see this character much, but when he speaks, he will say something prophetic, even though he didn't realize that he was. He says, "Gentlemen, perhaps we shouldn't do anything about these disciples, and here's why. If what they're doing doesn't amount to much, it will fade away on its own. Don't work yourself up. Don't break a sweat flogging these guys. Don't get yourself all bent out of shape over what they're doing. If what they are doing is purely human, it will fade on its own. But know this, if what they're doing is a voice sounding like a trumpet, then it is of God, and there is nothing you can do. Whether you flog them, torture them, imprison them, there is nothing that you can do because they are mobilized. Walls are getting ready to come down, and there is nothing you can do to resist the mighty arm of God." Well, Gamaliel didn't realize that he was pronouncing a prophetic word in that moment, because in that moment, it would begin shockwaves that would be felt right up until this present day. People who can't keep it inside, people who can't contain the message. They know that when they proclaim it, just like Jesus coming out of a tomb, we come out of tombs. We come out of tombs of fear. We come out of tombs of insecurity. They're never going to listen to me. They'll never get past my southern accent. They're not going to listen. They're not going to respect me. Leave that to me. You just sound your voice like a trumpet. You leave the southern accent to me. I will deal with that stuff, and we will get business done. Walls will come down, and good things will happen. You might be surprised to know that the very first gospel that was written was Mark's gospel. And do you know that it wasn't written until 60 AD? It's said by commentators that the first documents of the New Testament that were produced was Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, and that didn't arise until 50 AD. Imagine that. The very first documents of the New Testament didn't arise until 20 years after Jesus' resurrection. The first gospel didn't arise until 30 years after Jesus' resurrection. What were they doing for 20, 30 Easters? What were they doing? They certainly didn't have anything to read. You know what they were doing? Their voices were sounding like trumpets. Easter was proclaimed. Jesus had told them, "You will be my witnesses." And so for 2 decades, 3 decades, before they were inspired to begin recording the Gospels that we now have in Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and the rest of the New Testament unfolded and began to take shape and was canonized over the years that followed. But we know that in the 20 or 30 years, the 2 or 3 decades that preceded the first Easter, it was essentially and primarily and predominantly voices like trumpets, breaking down walls, sounding their voices, reverberating through the ages. Here's what you want to take note of, friends. The great truths of God do not defend themselves. Y'all with me? The great truths of God do not defend themselves. God's word has never conquered as a silent force. We just don't lay the Bible out there in the street and say, "Do your stuff." No, friends, you become the mouthpiece. You become the trumpet. You are the one that becomes the vessel through which these words are embodied and enabled, and you become a witness. You become like Jesus, a living and active word. He electrifies it through your life. And so you find that when you speak, things happen. The ground surges beneath your feet. People can feel the tremor before they even hear you. And so we know that God's word never conquers as a silent force. It was David who proclaimed, "Let the redeemed say so." He doesn't say, "Just let the redeemed stay in their private homes, lock the doors, and as silently and as hushed tones as possible, just think good and noble things. I'm glad that Jesus is risen." I don't want anybody to hear that, but I am very glad about it, and I'm going to meditate on this very quietly and privately and personally. How would the church have ever taken off if that had been the mentality of people like Peter and John? All they would have had to have done is just give them a warning. Just give them a warning. They wouldn't even have to flog them. "You guys are out of line, and if you don't get it back into line, you're going to suffer." Oh, that's all it took. Let's get back home and just think warm and noble thoughts. No, they weren't about to do this. This was tired, huddled masses on our hands, friends. Commentators tell us that even by the time Paul was writing, and this was 50 AD, mind you, this was 20 years after Jesus' resurrection, only 1 out of 5,000 people in the Roman Empire were believers. I tell people, we live in the city of Goldsboro, where in the confines of our city limit are what, 45,000 people? Let's just take a round estimate. We would have about 10 believers in this city. And imagine Jesus. He's going to tell those tired, huddled masses, "You are my witnesses." You mean in the city of Goldsboro? No, I mean bigger than that. Oh, you mean in the region? No, I mean even wider than that. You mean the Triangle area, Durham, Raleigh, Cary? No, I mean even bigger than that. What about the state of North Carolina? Even bigger than that. How about America? Even bigger than that. I'm talking about all the nations, the entire world. I can barely speak a southern accent in North Carolina. What are you telling me? I got to witness to this like a trumpet all around the world? You leave that to me, Jesus says. You just concern yourself over sounding your voice like a trumpet. You've got to bear in mind that they didn't have any advantages, and they had all the disadvantages. They didn't have anybody jockeying in their favor. There was no government high person in their favor. There was no person in the military in their favor. There was no person pulling strings for them behind the scenes in their favor. There was no famous personality of the day like we would have in Hollywood that could just kind of speak for them and jockey in their favor. They had none of that. It was just this past weekend on Good Friday where I felt myself cringe inside. One of our prominent nation's newspapers, if I might use that term lightly, did a story, and here's what it was called. Child stands up to parents and rejects the faith. Now, I thought, child comes out and rejects their parents' faith. Now, I was not concerned about the teenager. I was once one, and you should feel sorry for me when I was a teenager, awkward, stumbling, bumbling, underdeveloped in every way. I'm glad that nobody from any newspaper showed up at my house at the age of 18 and cared to give me an interview as to my views on the universe. But what really troubled me about that article on Good Friday, mind you, was that the journalist was hereby announcing to us all that it wasn't Jesus who was heroic in going self-sacrificially for us on this day. No, who's heroic is this stumbling, bumbling, undeveloped teenager who is coming out so bravely, so heroically to the parents in rejecting the faith. That's real bravery. We need to report on that. Somebody get a journalist down there to the house. We've got a teenager who's making a stand that nobody's ever made in 2,000 years. Nobody has ever rejected the faith in 2,000 years. No teenager has ever thought, I know more than anybody else and I'm going to figure out the universe. Nobody's ever done this before. So get down there with the journalist, get some pictures, get some quotes down there, because this is something dramatic. We need to get an interview here. You know, before I started to cringe and think, what do we got here? I remember that somebody wise said, you can tell a lot by culture by the information that they consider newsworthy. Well, it wasn't just the 21st century and somebody interviewing a teenager about rejecting Good Friday. No, Matthew 28 reports that on the very first day of Easter, what's the report? What's the official news report of the day? What is the official report? That the disciples stole the body. And so when Josephus, the official Roman historian, Josephus is writing the history of this, if you go back and read Josephus's histories, Do you know what he says? He says the official report of the day was that Jesus was this Messiah figure. He was crucified, and on the third day it was said that the disciples stole the body. The end. On to the next issue. So the moment the disciples opened their mind, the moment they opened their mouth, they were automatically branded as liars. We've already heard the official report. Prominent newspapers here in Rome have already told us what's happened. And what you are saying is contradictory. You've stolen this body. You're trying to, create some kind of manipulative scheme on us. And so we find that they were considered liars. And then you find in, Acts 2, they're even considered a little off the rocker. Don't listen to these people. They're a little tipsy this morning. They've been hitting the bottle. Peter was like, hey, give us a little respect. We haven't even gotten through breakfast yet. Come back in the afternoon. They were going to be considered liars. They're going to be considered lunatics. They were dismissed. They were marginalized. They were ostracized. They were incriminated. They were tortured. But the one thing that you could not do, you could not silence them. They had a voice like a trumpet. One commentator has said that in the Aramaic vocabulary, there may have been 200,000 words. 200,000 words available. But on that day, Gamaliel and his friends were trying to tell Peter and John, you have 199,997 words available in your lexicon. 3 of them has just been omitted right now. We've just omitted 3 of them. He is risen. You will forget those words. You will not say those words. You will not think those words. You will not mention those words in your sleep. Those words are forever omitted from your vocabulary. Peter and John's answer is that we got 200,000 words. We're just, we're fishermen. We don't know that many. We're in the hundreds, not the thousands. But one thing we can tell you is that even if we have 199,997 words, we're going to go to our grave only saying 3 of them. He is risen. And so we find, friends, that remarkable sounding of the trumpet that you found in Joshua, shattering walls, bringing down fortresses, the storming of the Bastille where things were crumbled into dust and people went from barriers into the promised places that God had prepared for them. Now it's human voices that become like trumpets. We're the ones that's sounding like the Joshua horns. We're the ones that's proclaiming, bringing down barriers and things that are shattering in all directions. Earthquakes happen. Tremors are happening. The ground is surging beneath our feet. And so we find that even if they faced overwhelming odds, that they were able to triumph, and God gave them an invincible spirit. What's remarkable is that you would have people like Peter and John just proclaiming a sermon. And then you would have people just smitten to their hearts saying, what must we do to be saved? Did Peter and John resurrect somebody from the dead and say, here's why? Do you know what they gave those people? They gave them inspired words. They told them, he is risen. And when they said it, you felt the ground surge beneath your feet. Jesus told the disciples that when you proclaim my name, it's no small thing, because I become manifested through the message. I become manifested every time you proclaim he is risen. You are bringing Easter 2,000 years into the present, and the power of Christ roams free wherever his resurrection is proclaimed. And so as we manifest the message in our places, as surreal as they are, you will find, friends, that when you honor God by allowing him to use your voice as a trumpet, that the walls in your life, the fears, the inhibitions, the insecurities that hold you back, you will find those barriers crumbling into dust, and you'll find yourself striding into the places of promise. Dear Jesus, we thank you for the strange and surreal story of Joshua and the horn that sounded the signal to mobilize. God is getting ready to get on the move. Wonderful things are getting ready to happen. But when we flash forward to Easter, now it is our voices that sound like a trumpet. I pray, Lord, that even today, in our surreal circumstances, that you will remind us that there is nothing more surreal than your resurrection that has defined all of history. And there is nothing louder, and there is nothing more surging, and there is nothing more tremoring. There is nothing that will shock this world more than we allow our voices to become like trumpets. Maybe even on this Easter Sunday, somebody might open up their back door or window and just have to proclaim in an irresistible way, He is risen. Amen.